Welcome to Federal and State Affairs Committee. I'm going to first ask for bill introductions before we get started. And we got Matt Bengesser up here from the AG's office. Matt?
Get this on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Matt Bengesser with the Office of the Kansas Attorney General. Today, I'm requesting that 24 RS 3105 be introduced into this committee. 24 RS 3105 is a cleanup bill related to our state's concealed carry laws. Included in this cleanup is the establishment of a policy for returning revoked or suspended licenses to the Office of the Kansas Attorney General.
Committee, any questions or objections to introduction to this bill? Seeing none, that bill is introduced. Any other bill introductions? Senator Straub?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two, actually. The first one's fairly simple, just updating cities to reconnect properties that have been disconnected from a city sewer system upon the request of the property owner. And that statute is so old that there's a number of language updates, cleanup to that bill also. And that is RS 2939.
Okay. Committee, any questions or objections to introduction to that bill? Seeing none, that is introduced.
Then I also have 24 RS 3055, which is an AI bill to protect against deep fakes and using someone's likeness or image in obscene material.
Very good. Any questions or objections to introduction to that bill? Seeing none, that one is introduced. Any other bill introductions in the audience or in the committee? Okay, I have a couple. I've got 24 RS 3071, and that is enacting the Kansas Specie Legal Tender Act and the Kansas Bullion Depository Act. It's kind of a companion bill to what we passed earlier on, but it establishes a bullion depository. Any questions or objections to introduction of that bill? Seeing none, that is introduced. We also have 24 RS 2617 concerning crimes and punishment relating to promotion to minors of material harmful to minors and removing an affirmative defense. Any questions or objections to the introduction of that bill? Seeing none, that is introduced. We also have 24 RS 2892 regarding in ESG criteria for insurance companies. Any questions or objections to introduction to that bill? Seeing none, that is introduced. And finally, 24 RS 2319, and that is a companion bill to one coming from the House regarding to reliability of electric generation facilities. Any objections or questions to the introduction of that bill? Seeing none, that is introduced. Okay, committee, I think we're done with bill introductions. Before we get started on the hearing, we'd like to entertain final action on the state fire marshal confirmation. And I believe we can either refer favorably, unfavorably, or neutral to recommendation on confirmation of the state fire marshal, Mark Ingholm. Do I have a motion on that? Senator Longbine.
I would move that we recommend to the full Senate favorable for the state fire marshal.
Very good. We have a motion by Senator Longbine, second by Senator Peterson. Any discussion on state fire marshal? Seeing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. That his recommendation goes favorably then for Mark Ingholm as state fire marshal to the full Senate committee. All right, now let's open the hearing on Senate Bill 370. And before we get started, let's have Jason give us an overview of that bill. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 370 is concerned with national heritage areas and national historic trails that are designated under federal law. The bill would require prior approval by the state legislature before certain actions could be taken with respect to national heritage areas and national historic trails. Specifically under the bill, if any portion of a national heritage area or national historic trail is to extend beyond federal land in the state, then that extension would have to be approved by the state legislature before that could be designated. Additionally, no matching state funds and no state resources could be used for a national heritage area or national historic trail or included in the areas of those designations without prior approval by the state legislature. Senate Bill 370 would go into effect on July 1st of this year, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Committee, any questions? Seeing none, we will move to our proponent testimony. I'm going to have, I'm going to open for testimony for 20 minutes this time, since we really don't have any neutrals or oral opponents at all. Though there are two oral, oh, that's right, there are two oral neutrals. So 20 minutes for the proponents to give us an overview. And typically I wait until the end for questions, but Representative Fairchild has to carry a bill on the House floor. So we'll open for questions for him after his testimony and then hold for questions after the rest. So Representative Fairchild, you're up first. And we'll start the clock on 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to testify in favor of this bill today. A couple of months ago, I introduced a bill in the House that contains this exact same language, and that's the reason why I'm here today. And I introduced the House bill on behalf of Mrs. Angel Cushing, and she's a conservative political activist here in Kansas, and she's here today, and she'll also be here testifying today. And if you have any questions for me that I'm not able to answer, I'm sure she'll be able to answer them for you. She's much more of an expert on this issue than I am. From my perspective, over the past several decades, the size and the scope of the federal government has grown far beyond what our founding fathers ever intended. I believe that our founders intended to put strict limits on the federal government, on the size and power of the federal government. But instead, we've allowed the federal government to continue to grow. And as a result of that, I believe the federal government has infringed on the rights of the people, including infringing on private property rights. From my perspective, that problem has become worse during the Biden administration. We've seen the 30 by 30 proposal from the Biden administration, which is a worldwide initiative to designate 30% of the Earth's land and ocean as protected areas by 2030. From my perspective, that's problematic because I don't believe that there's any realistic way to actually accomplish that through voluntary means. I think there's a possibility that in order for them to be able to accomplish that, that would have to be accomplished through more mandatory means that would include things like eminent domain and infringing on private property rights. So that's my concern about that. From the research that I've done, many of the same people that are big proponents of the 30 by 30 initiative are also big proponents of expanding the national trails and the national heritage areas. And many of those who are proponents of 30 by 30 see a connection between those things, and they see the expansion of the national trails and the national heritage areas as being key to promoting the 30 by 30 initiative. The opponents of this bill, they'll probably claim that eminent domain is never used to create national trails and national heritage areas. However, this is not exactly correct. For example, the Appalachian Trail used eminent domain over 400 times. The National Park Service acquired 15,266 acres along the trail through eminent domain between 1986 and 1997 out of nearly 150,000 total acres along the trail. In addition to that, even though eminent domain is not normally used along the trails, there's always the potential for eminent domain to be used along the trails. For example, many of those that are the biggest advocates for the trails are also advocating for using eminent domain along the trail in order to fill in the gaps. And when I'm talking about the gaps, what I'm referring to is that there's thousands of miles of privately owned land along the trail. And a lot of times the National Park Service has problems getting people to comply and getting people to open up their land to these trails. And then in addition to that, a lot of times the National Park Service will enter into an agreement with these landowners to allow them to have access to their land for the trails. However, a lot of times these landowners will then sell their land to another landowner, and then the new landowner does not have to comply with the original agreement entered into by the original landowner. And so you have a situation there with the new landowners where the new landowners are not allowing access to their land for the purpose of the trails. And then what happens in that situation is that they then have to reroute around those areas that are held by the new landowners. And so that's very expensive and very cumbersome for the National Park Service to have to do that, to have to reroute around all these privately owned acres of land. And therefore, you have these people that are the biggest advocates of the national trails who are saying the only way to actually fill in these gaps where you have all these acres of the private ownership of land, the only realistic way to accomplish this, they say, is through the use of eminent domain. And therefore, it is something that's a concern and something that could potentially happen, even though it may not be something that's commonly practiced along the trails. Lastly, from my perspective, I believe that the goal of this legislation is basically to keep the federal government within its box. I wouldn't personally have a problem with funding the trails and the national heritage areas if the federal government could clearly prove that they're being respectful of private property rights and that they're not going to expand beyond what their power should be. However, as I said, I do have concerns that the federal government could go beyond what they should be doing and they could infringe on private property rights with these trails. In addition to that, eminent domain is not the only concern as far as what the federal government could do along these trails. There are other ways where they actively are infringing on private property rights. Some of those things, such as conservation easements, I'm not going to go into detail on because some of the other proponents will likely cover that. But I just thought I'd mention that there are several other ways in which the National Park Service is infringing on private property rights from my perspective on these trails, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. And basically, this bill is just allowing the legislature to review the issue, and it's basically just giving more power to the people through their elected representatives to have a say on this issue. And so I believe it's necessary to pass this bill just in order to give the people more of a say through their elected representatives and basically to restrict the power, restrict the scope of the federal government, as we've seen the federal government become far too big and expansive. I'll stand for questions.
Okay, I'll suspend the clock for now, and we'll open to questions from the committee for anybody. Senator Blasey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few questions. You said you introduced this in the House. What's the current status of the bill in the House?
We're having a hearing on it tomorrow in the House.
Okay. And then the second question I have is just Section 1A. If Congress declares Stafford County to be a national park, if this bill was law today and Congress declares Stafford County to be a park, I mean, wouldn't that supremacy clause trump any of this legislation? I guess help me understand the necessity, because at the end of the day, the feds are going to do what they're going to do. I'm a firm supporter of the 10th Amendment. I think it's trampled on every day by the federal government, but I'm just curious what this actually will accomplish if Congress decides to do what they're going to do, or the federal government.
Well, I think the main purpose of this is simply to perhaps prevent state funding of it. I mean, that's basically what we have control of. I mean, we can't necessarily prevent Congress from having a national park wherever, but it's basically just to basically requires the legislature to have a vote on this, and if the legislature votes no, then that basically prohibits any state funding for any of these things. I think it just refers to the national trails and national heritage areas. I don't know that it would cover national parks, but it refers to national trails, national heritage areas.
So does the United States National Park Service, are they able to declare national heritage areas or trails without Congress's approval?
Could you repeat that?
Is the United States National Park Service, are they able to declare a national heritage area or historic trail without congressional?
Not that I know of. I think they have to have congressional approval for that.
Thank you.
Jason, you'll confirm that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, there's an act of Congress must be passed to establish a national heritage area.
Thank you, Jason. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, Representative. We appreciate your testimony. All righty, I'll restart the clock here, and we've got about 13 minutes left for the final 3 oral conferees. Up next is Representative Rebecca Schmoe. And Representative, start the clock and again, allow time for the other conferees.
Thank you, Chairman. Members of committee, you have my testimony provided to you. I'll make this pretty simple. What we're looking at in this bill is restoring some semblance of local control and fiscal responsibility. The biggest issues that we see in this is that we're not here to approve or deny any kind of land acquisition or what the federal government wants to do as far as the national trails and the heritage. What we're doing today is just making sure that there is a way that our constituents, the people of Kansas, can hold someone accountable, whether it is through our fiscal responsibility to the people of Kansas and making sure that we are upkeeping these areas, or whether it is local control. And if the federal government starts to encroach on state property or personal property, then the people of Kansas have somewhere to go. They have a direct elected representative that they can hold accountable for either protecting or maintaining their property. We need to make sure that we have a clear avenue for our constituents to be able to contact someone when they feel like their rights and their property is being taken advantage of. As it stands right now, if it is an entity or a business or even the federal government, there is very little accountability. And we are simply trying to create that barrier between the federal government and the property owners so that they can have a direct contact. As President Truman coined, and I'm encouraging you to instill with the passage of SB 370, the buck stops here. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Up next, we have Angel Cushing. Angel will give us some testimony on this. Welcome to the committee, Angel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I just want to explain the bill a little bit more. You're absolutely right. The only one that can make a national trail or a national heritage area is Congress. When we dropped a Freedom of Information request on the Kansas-Nebraska Heritage Area Partnership, we learned from their minutes that they had lobbied Congress for 5 years before anybody found out that their area was targeted for a national heritage area. So what this does is allows the opportunity for people to find out. Since 1984, when the first national heritage area went in, the request was let the people know. So just to put this in perspective, if you win Yard of the Month, if you're nominated for Yard of the Month in your community, they knock on your door. They ask you if they can put a sign in your yard. They ask you if they can put your name in the newspaper. These guys don't do this. They're using personal property in order to gain funding for their special interest projects. They come with federal land management plans that are guided by the National Park Service. The difference between an NHA and a trail is a trail right out of the gate, as soon as it's designated by Congress, becomes a National Park Service unit. They will tell you that they protect private property. Yet if you get on the Facebook Kansas Rail for Trail, where I put a picture of all the national trails on there, they asked why we would be against putting more roads on and creating more public access for individuals. So even though the National Park Service regards it as private property, the general public does not. So what this bill does is ask for the opportunity for people to find out that these jurisdictions are coming in by forcing them to lobby not only Congress, but to also lobby you. If they fail to win over the state legislature, then that forces them to have to lobby the communities in which they wish to put these jurisdictions over. This is important because the National Park Service actually requires that they do this. They're supposed to be community-led and community-sponsored. So if they fail to get a vote, they can go back to that community and ask for that money. This legislation does not eliminate any trails. It does not eliminate any borders. It does not change the deeds of any properties. It does not fire anybody. It does not relocate anybody. All it does is demand transparency and notification of the people. Thank you. I stand for questions if you have any afterwards, correct?
Yes, absolutely, Angel. Thank you very much. Up next, we have Beth Salmons.
I've got kind of a long testimony, but I want to drill down on the NEPA regulations for this, any type of federal designation. I want to thank the committee for having this hearing and hearing us out. I'll be drilling down on only one aspect of the dangers these present for our farming and ranching communities, which is the National Environmental Protection Act manual for national heritage areas. This is the environmental impact study that is required for all federal projects, such as the trails, heritage areas, parks, other federally designated areas. The requirements set out in these manuals interfere with farming, ranching, and all other protected private property rights that come with land ownership, from the smallest lot in the city to the largest farm and ranch out there. Farming and ranching are Kansas, and we need to protect that at all costs. My greatest concern about the heritage areas is the National Environmental Protection Act manual. That's my thing about this. On forward page 2, actually it's page 2, the manual states that they are pleased to release the policy guide formulated specifically for these NHAs by the National Park Service environmental coordinators and the NHA program coordinators. Not one ag representative is mentioned, even though when created the NHA program applies to every inch of that boundary that they have arbitrarily drawn. Once this draft planning framework is drawn, it is submitted to the National Park Service, who then determines which NEPA pathway to follow for the specific NHA that is being created. On page 1, paragraph 1.1, the manual states, since NHA management plans are approved by the Secretary of Interior, the approval is considered a federal action, and then therefore the federal environmental protection rules, regulations, and well, all federal laws, rules, and regulations will apply to every inch of that. Let's see. Okay, they list therefore the environmental laws, including NEPA, and other laws such as Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, must be followed. Those are their favorites. We also believe that the waters of the U.S. will be pulled into this as well because they mention controlling water also. The new rules were posted for the WOTUS in September 2023 for comment. In that posting, they stated that all the old rules that were taken out by the previous administration were going to be returned, and they would be enhancing the new WOTUS rules. I'm still waiting to find out how you can enhance calling a puddle on your farm a wetland, therefore restricting your private property rights. The specific NHA affecting Kansas is the Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area. Fortunately, we were able to stop the Kansas-Nebraska NHA That included 26 counties in Kansas and 23 in Nebraska from designation by Congress. The Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area includes 29 counties in Kansas, 12 in Missouri, 4 counties already included in, 4 that were in Freedom's Frontier were also proposed to be included in the Kansas-Nebraska NHA. The reason given for wanting to include whole countries in such a large group is to promote tourism. But if that's the real reason, then why does this designation come with its own NEPA management manual, claiming a federal boundary around all the counties to bring in federal jurisdiction laws and regulations to every inch? You must ask yourself that question. The favorite laws listed by this manual are frightening and devastating to farming and ranching operations. EPA already runs roughshod over the farmers and ranchers without a federal boundary created around them. They have EPA rules, regulations governing the way they take care of livestock, farming methods, chemical applications. I'm recovering from illness, so I'm a little out of breath, but about everything they do on private property, they are regulated for. I thought that the USDA was supposed to be assisting farming and ranching, not trying to shut them down. Creating an NHA on top of farmers just doubles up on that same type of regulation. There's no one better at taking care of the land entrusted to them than the generational farmer and rancher. They improve the land to be able to pass it on to their children and grandchildren in better condition than it was given to them. Federal government doesn't need to come in and tell them how to do it. The National Historic Preservation is specifically listed in this manual and is also claimed as a tool. While NHA claims to help preserve historical sites within the NHA by available of grant money, it can be used as a tool to prevent private property owners from doing what they want or need to do with their private property. It claims to promote tourism by connecting these cities and counties themselves, or by connecting these historical sites together. And really, there's no one better at promoting these communities than the communities themselves. And there's other sources such as state and national historic societies. Endangered Species Act is also another favorite. And it's especially threatening to property rights as the government can severely restrict the use of land affected by any endangered species that happens to be inhabiting the property. This act was used to shut down the logging industry out west because the snowy owl was listed as an endangered species and was inhabiting the area where the logging was being performed. When we first started fighting the Kansas NHA, I was talking to a generational farmer in Potawatomi County, and he told me he was aware of 30 by 30. Oh, 1 minute? Anyway, he received, now I'm nervous. Anyway, he received notification that he needed to provide or fill out this survey he had received on a specific bat that was like nesting on his property, what its nesting habits were, when it would go out to feed, such. So he took it down. He was smart enough to know not to answer those questions. He took it back down to his agent and said, "You get me out of this program now. I trusted you." So, you know, that's where these NHAs are dangerous, because Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area has the endangered species listed for every county within that designated area, not only state but federal endangered species, every one of them. So they're ready to roll on that one. But these things go past they go past the people and the government, or the county government, and they go past the state legislature straight up in their rubber stamp. Okay. So we want to stop it here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any questions?
Well, we'll open it up to questions now for the committee, to any of our proponent conferees. Committee, any questions for Rebecca Schmoe, Angel Cushing, or Beth Sammons? Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know many of the people in the room here today are very familiar with Biden's executive order in his 30/30 agenda, but there's probably no one more well-versed on it in this room than Angel Cushing. So my question's for you, and really not a question that I have, but maybe so you could share with those that are watching online too, how these national heritage areas or national historic trails, how land use is used to control private property owners.
30 by 30 is an executive order that was signed by Biden in January of 2021. It is the first time an administration has confessed to doing what they've been doing in Western states for many, many years. 30 by 30 is Buffalo Commons, just rebranded. And as of the end of the 2022, it is 100% financially funded. The laws in place to implement 30 by 30 have been there. The strongest one getting in 1987, and they continue to get stronger as time goes on. So as what we're seeing is they are taking already owned federal lands and they are locking them up and closing access to people. So that means your favorite campgrounds, your hiking trails, your picnic areas, they're closing them off to people and then pushing that into bottleneck areas. And you'll find those bottleneck areas are usually landlocked by private landowners all the way around. And that's to encourage harassment to that property so that they can acquire more. Conservation easements is a method that they use. Also federal jurisdictions and designations. Once those go in place, they are immediately lobbied in Congress to expand more and do more. Protect the view shed, to expand the land mass. And generally, if you look up the term regulatory takings, that is the method of which they do that. Now, as to each NHA and trail, it all depends on that special interest group. In Kansas, we have pretty good ones that are pretty benign, really haven't been interested in introducing or implementing those land management plans. The same thing, using Santa Fe Trail as an example, right across the state line in Colorado is a whole nother ball game. They even get on Pinyon Canyon and Fort Riley about lights. So it's at a minimum, it is a lobby mechanism in Congress to do more preservation and more restrictions of private property as they close up land on already owned property. Eventually, the idea is to depopulate that area until they can expand public use of it.
Senator Cluse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and questions for you. So help me understand this. So you said currently the federal government, they pretty well finance all this. What part, like presently or in the past, involvement for state dollars for these projects? I mean,
so that's an excellent question. The biggest problem with nonprofits, and these are government partnerships with nonprofits, is you cannot drop a Freedom of Information request on them. So all I can get is based off of their tax forms. And using 2019 as an example, they made $1.3 million. 47% of that is from public funding, primarily through Kansas Parks and Wildlife and Kansas Department of Transportation. And that's in regard to Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. Trails are totally different. Trails get no state funding whatsoever. The minute they are passed by Congress, they are a National Park Service unit and fall under the National Park Service budget. So I should probably clarify that once that money is there, the whole goal of getting that money is to get the 50% matching federal grants to go with that. So for every dollar that they get from, say, Kansas Parks and Wildlife, they get a matching dollar from the federal government.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Angel. I appreciate that. Actually, I do have one quick one for you. The Antiquities Act, they've used that numerous times in other states to restrict drilling on federal land or to take land to do that and restrict drilling, correct?
So when I first got into this, that was the #1 question I asked of every lawyer that I came across. Technically, because we're military background, so I'm thinking of Fort Riley here. So technically, when you create a federal jurisdiction voted on by Congress, do all the federal laws come into play? And the answer is yes, including the Antiquities Act of 1906. I don't think that it's going to be implemented until they get that population down. So the goal is to depopulate the area until they have robbed enough members of Congress that there isn't a big enough objection to stop a new monument or a new preserve.
Thank you, Angel. I appreciate that. All right, committee, we've got a number of other proponent testimony written only. I think it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, close to a dozen for your review on this subject. We also have 2 oral neutral conferees, and I think we'll do 10 minutes for both and then open for questions. So first up is Bob Totten, Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area Board of Trustee. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Bob Totten. I'm the Executive Director of the Shawnee County Historical Society, which is a member of the Freedom's Frontier group that you're just talking about. And we are taking a neutral position on this because, quite honestly, the only concerns we have happen to do in your comments that talk about whereas. I specifically would say line 13, there seem to be some incorrect things talked about. Just a minute ago, we talked about funding, and Senator Cluse's comment about funding. We do not get any state funding. I don't get any state funding with the Shawnee County Historical Society. Basically, the society, as well as the other museums and so forth, are members of this group of 41 counties to promote, as she mentioned, tourism. $1 in for tourism provides $5.50 of return. We have folks from China and Denmark and Florida and other places who come to town here in Topeka for the Shawnee County Historical Society, and they do that in statewide. You folks have, with some of my testimony, which I know you're going to be able to read at some point in time because it's important, but these are I gave you a kind of a map to show you the spots of places that are basically the network in regards to this. We're not having problems with this if you change the language, but I do want to stress to you that there are no state dollars that go into the feds. This was a program started by President Reagan in 1984, was approved by George Bush, and also supported by Trump in the most recent times, and the Senate passed unanimously funding for the National Heritage Group. This is a deal to make sure that museums do apply for grants. You could donate if you'd like to any of this, but it's not funded by the federal government besides the grants that have already been authorized with the money that's involved. But there are no state funds. There's no effort to grab land. We're not worrying about that. This is done at the county level. So if you need to have your museum or something be part of this, your county commissions, which is a subset of the state of Kansas, make the decision on whether they want to opt in. Most counties do opt in. Osage County, though, is one that decided to opt out. They're not part of the National Heritage Foundation Freedom's Frontier that we're involved in. We're taking a neutral position as long as we can get with Jason and whomever we need to change some of the language because some of the whereases are not correct. I'll be glad to answer any questions at the time when you want to designate. Thank you for your time.
And your testimony, Bob, do you have those listed of what you object to in the whereases in your testimony?
No, I do not.
You could send
line
that.
13 is one. I did designate personally, but I can get that to Jason or whomever you designate to make sure that we can get that correct so that you don't pass legislation that's incorrect. Thank you,
Bob. Up next, we have Steve Hitchcock, also Secretary of Board of Trustees from the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Act. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. I also spend time here at the Ag committees working for an Ag organization, but that doesn't apply today. I'm here as a member of the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area Board of Directors. I live in Baldwin City. I have been involved with various historical societies, including the Heritage Area, for several years. And I'm an old history teacher for a long time. And what appealed to me about the Heritage Area, and this is in contrast with, not direct contrast, but in contrast, local community activism and local community history groups are a key part of us understanding who we are. But it's not all of it. And one of the things that a state historical society, a regional organization, or in this case a heritage area, does is provide connection and context. Just upstairs is the Stuart Curry mural of John Brown. That's the image of John Brown that is known worldwide and associated with Kansas. And that's a wonderful thing that we have something that grabs that attention. But to understand John Brown and to understand pre-Civil War Kansas is much more complex than that. To understand that, you need to not only see that mural, you also need to visit the Blackjack Battlefield east of Baldwin City. You also need to understand Pottawatomie Creek and Brown's actions at Osawatomie. And that's part of what a regional organization like this does. My concerns, as Mr. Totten's, are mainly with the whereas clauses. Like he said, a heritage area doesn't receive state money. That's an incorrect assertion. The other thing that really caught my attention and continues to catch my attention is the assertion of a jurisdiction, that this boundary is somehow a federal jurisdiction. A jurisdiction implies control and authority, and a heritage area does not have that. It has a boundary of eligibility. A county has jurisdiction. That means the county sheriff can do something. It means a county court can do something. It means a county commission can do something. It can write ordinances. It can enforce laws. That's not what this boundary is. It's a boundary of eligibility. Just to mention a couple of things. The Appalachian Trail is a scenic trail, one of 11 in the United States under the National Park Service. It has the authority of eminent domain. It's the only one. That's not relevant to any of the other scenic trails. It's not relevant to the historic trails, and it's certainly not relevant to the heritage areas. No legislative authority covers those. The manual that was mentioned that talks about the guide for a heritage area doesn't turn the heritage area into an enforcement mechanism for the Antiquities Act or the Environmental Protection Act or the Endangered Species Act. What that guide does is it says, as an entity that is approved by the Secretary of the Interior through the National Park Service, this entity must follow these laws. If the heritage area goes into partnership with a local historical society for a preservation grant or some sort of partnership activity, what that says is the heritage area has to pay attention to these other federal laws. Back to the jurisdiction thing, the Antiquities Act depends on jurisdiction. And I've never seen any evidence that it has ever been used outside of federal lands, meaning BLM, Forest Service, National Grasslands. For the United States, or for the president, the executive, to use the Antiquities Act to declare a national monument, essentially is what that's about. In Kansas, there would be a handful of places. Cimarron National Grassland in Morton County is federal land. Quivira National Wildlife Refuge is federal land. McConnell Air Force Base, Fort Riley, Fort Leavenworth, those are actual federal lands. A heritage area does not have a federal land management plan. That is an absolutely inaccurate statement. It has a management plan. It doesn't have any land. So applying all of these things in some hypothetical is just not accurate. And that's why I'm here today. The legislation itself, this section 1A, 2, A, B, and C, I don't think are particularly dramatic in terms of what they would change. But as Mr. Totten said, the whereas clauses are part of the public record, and we want to be part of the public record also, saying that those whereas clauses are based on some very inaccurate information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Steve. And if you and Bob would put your head together and send me that list and copy Jason on it, I'd appreciate that very much.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Committee, any questions for either of our neutral conferees? Senator Straub?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Forgive me for not knowing this, but how is the Board of Trustees of Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area, how is that board elected or appointed? And is there any compensation for you as trustees?
I can answer the second part very easily. There is no compensation. It is a voluntary board. The actual process, I'll defer to, if you don't mind, if I could ask Lucinda Adams, who is the executive director of Freedom's Frontier.
Sure, Lucinda, come on up.
To answer the question about the board of directors, our board of directors are voted on by the current trustees, and it's basically people that are interested in history and the well-being of the organization.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, the National Heritage Area, I believe it was Bob that stated that they had received federal grant funds maybe, but that it's not continually funded by federal monies. But anytime you receive federal funds for anything, whether it be a grant or whatever, there are always guidelines and stipulations on how you can use those funds. So does the Heritage Area Board of Trustees continue to operate on grant funds that were previously received?
To me, is appropriations. Through the appropriation process of Congress is how this is funded. And we just went through this in the last year and a half, where the Senate and the House agreed to provide funding for this, to provide her and her staff the ability to network with the respective historical sites. So yes, that is in a form, I guess, but it's approved by our Congress, and that's where the funding comes from.
We do receive grant funds from various organizations. We are allowed to apply for federal grants or through a local foundation. So, but we do not use any federal grants that we receive. We cannot use those as our match for the funding that we receive through the appropriation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That does help explain that, but I think what was previously stated was that it's not funded by, so I'm going to have to think about this a little bit, but it sounds like there is federal money coming in, and we all know that anytime, it doesn't matter where the federal dollars are involved, there are strings attached. So thank you.
Senator Faustigedo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this question might be for you or staff. So the one person, Dennis, who's in opposition, what would that mean?
His testimony is on the S drive. It's a written only. Dennis Katzenmeyer, it looks like Western Cattle Trail Association. And so you would have to read that. It's in your S drive on your computer.
I was going to ask you to give me his thoughts, but I'll read that. My question is for Bob Totten. It's good to see you, Bob. So on Senator's follow-up somewhat on, because I had the same question as Senator Straub. So you get the federal funding. However,
there are National Heritage Foundation or sections throughout the country. And so we are a 41 county area of Missouri and Kansas, and we base the ability to have a staff and to do this networking and providing property to encourage tourism and historical site preservation, we rely on the federal government to provide that funding that you're talking about. It is done, as an example, in Raleigh County, West Virginia, the New River Gorge. They have a heritage site. This was debated by our Congress, decided how much was to be provided, and we get a slice of the pie. That's really what it's for.
So, Mr. Chairman, Bob, so where does the matching funds, explain that piece? So you're writing a grant and then matching funds.
I hope I'm in the right category. I really don't get into that. In my situation, if I can come up with a certain amount of money, then I can apply to the Heritage Group and they can match that, sometimes up to 50% or whatever, in regards to building, painting. I mean, I've got 2 buildings over here 6 blocks away that some of your spouses have had the opportunity to visit, which I appreciate that. We have to keep the upkeep, and that's one way to make sure that that's done, because our budget is so slim, we wouldn't be able to do it by ourselves.
Mr. Chairman, so the matching funds come from the federal funds?
No, not a lot of times. In our case, we have donations from folks, contributions, and we have a foundation that donates $5,000 a year that we could use as a matching grant that we could apply for with the Heritage Foundation. So that's what we would do as the Shawnee County Historical Society. I'm sure Baxter Springs and others have done the same thing. I know Lawrence has several projects involved, and I think Lucinda probably could address that better than I can. I just know my little niche of it.
Sure thing. And by the way, Senator, basically the opponent written testimony, the nut of it was your typical individual private property rights argument that they should be able to decide whether or not to participate in the trails or not. Senator Cluse?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, Bob, can I have you come back? So we've spent a lot of time digressing on the funding congressionally, but the bill is prohibiting state funding of any national heritage. And I don't know if I quite have come to understanding. So you had said no state funds directly, but then we heard earlier maybe indirectly through a different agency or nonprofit or something like that. Can you just speak to that one last time? I'm just kind of wanting to concentrate on not necessarily what the feds are doing, but the bill's dealing with the state funding.
In our opinion, as the Freedom's Frontier Group, we do not get any state funding. I know that the comment was made that KDOT provided some money in wildlife and parks back, I guess, in 2019, and I'm not familiar with that. I would assume it was a pass-through situation, but I'm not aware of what that is. I am not part of the finances of the Freedom's Frontier Group, as well as we have somebody here that could probably answer that better than I can. But to my knowledge, there is no state money that goes into the Freedom's Frontier. We don't plan on it. That's why we're somewhat neutral on this position. And I know from a personal standpoint for the Shawnee County Historical Society, we don't get any state or county or city funding for that project. Lucinda, would you like to address, if that's all right with the chair?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, because it seems like the conversation is that the feds do their part and then there's another part. I guess what I'm trying to focus in on is what's the state's part if this bill's enacted. You know, where are we sitting? What is it? I don't know. Maybe we need some research done on that part, whether it's a pass-through, whether it's an agency, just directly, indirectly. I think that could help.
We do not receive any state funding, and we do not receive any pass-throughs through state funding either. All of our match portions, so we receive our appropriation that's funneled through the National Park Service. And that is for every heritage area in the country, and there are 62 in the country. And we all almost receive the same amount of funding. And then we are required as an organization to match that $500,000 of funding. And we do our $500,000 match, and we have various ways we can do that through volunteer hours, calculating the cost of volunteers, and then private donations that we receive, and then also, depending on the grant that we receive, we can sometimes use that as a match. We cannot use, if we were to receive like a state grant or a federal grant, we cannot use those as our match. And we've never received a state grant. I know Mr. Totten mentioned something about KDOT, and that was early in the days of the heritage area, and that is through the roadside signs. And that's the only money that we've ever received. And that's just like any other historical organization that you would see, you know, for the Brown v. Board site, even for Bob Totten's, the Shawnee County Historical Society in Ritchie House. You know, where I'm from in Shawnee, we have Shawnee Town, the big sign off the sign of the interstate. So that is the fund money that we've received from KDOT.
Thank you. And Elena, if you could do a little research to see if there's any state money expended on those areas and get it to the committee, I'd appreciate it. Committee, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you everyone for your testimony. Committee, we have a bill hearing tomorrow. We may try to work a couple bills, I'm not sure yet, tomorrow or the next day. We have no other business at this time though, so thank you all for your work, and we are adjourned.